This is Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training. And today, for the next 60 minutes, we're going to be talking about building Canvas apps, and more specifically, building Canvas apps using standard guidelines and best practices. Pretty exciting topic. We had more people register for this webinar than any other webinar we've ever done before, so we know it must be a fairly hot topic. Lots of people are starting to adopt the Power Platform and get up to speed on the different types of Power Apps that you can create. Let's go ahead and get started. So before we get started, a quick marketing plug. I'll only take about 30 seconds. But what I wanted to do is just kind of make sure everyone's aware that at Critical Path Training, we have different types of training classes. And if I kind of quickly go to our website, once again, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but if I click on courses, we have a new course, which is Building Business Solutions with Power Apps and Flow. We also have new day of courses, basically 10 to 5 Eastern time, and it includes hands-on, and we have a schedule here. One other thing I wanted to point out is that there's an important URL, and if I go to github.com, Critical Path Training, that's where we have a bunch of GitHub repositories, and we have one that I've created to hand out a couple files in the slides for what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to go ahead and inside of the chat window, I'm going to go ahead and send everyone this URL just so you can get there. Note that there is the Power App, which is called Customer Ordering with Azure SQL. That's the main app that I'm going to be demoing today. Behind that, there's an Azure SQL database. So if you want to get this app up and running, I've given you the code to create the SQL database and a couple other files inside here. If you go into training, there's some more information about the training classes that we offer. Okay, back to the program. So what we're going to cover is we're going to start out just kind of posing what are the challenges as someone who's building Canvas apps. We want to look at naming conventions, fairly straight ahead, but very important to embrace because things get out of control pretty quickly if you don't use proper naming conventions. We're going to talk about different issues with screen design, doing things like using relative styling, choosing between edit forms, and using just the patch function to edit data. We're going to look at delegation and performance. We're going to look at state management. And one of the things that I find hard for people, especially without a developer background, is just really deciding as you put your app together what you want to start storing in global variables and collections. And what we'll find is the creative mind can come up with things, and sometimes you have to see someone else do it for the first time, and then the light goes off. At the very end, we're going to look at a preview feature, which is named components. And a component will give you the ability to create a piece of your user interface that you can reuse across multiple screens. Okay, so I'll wait to the end to introduce components and give you an idea of what they can do for us. Okay, a quick little introduction. What is the Power Platform? In late-breaking news, let me go ahead and stop my slides. The marketing team has decided to give up on their lowercase p and go to the uppercase P for the platform. Okay, I knew that you'd be excited about that. But it's basically the trio of Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow. What we're interested today is Power Apps. And basically the Power Platform is all created by, one body that kind of oversees several different teams and groups. Now, when we start building with Power Apps, what can we build? The one type of app that we've been building for the last 2 or 3 years are Canvas apps, and that's the focus of today's talk. When I build Canvas apps, we can also create connections. Now, other things that we can build that we won't talk about today is working with Microsoft Flow, and you could build flows, which are automated processes. You can work with the Common Data Service for apps, the CDS, and if you work with the Common Data Service, you can build model-driven apps. So those are all important Power Apps pieces, though we're just kind of focusing on the first one, Canvas apps. Now, if you are someone who's building Canvas apps, we're going to refer to you as an application or app maker or app builder. And one of the things that Microsoft, is keen to point out is that people can build these apps without a computer science background or without having an experience as a software developer. So that's good in many ways because we can build things much faster. We can often build things in weeks as opposed to months or years. Now, what are you responsible for if you're building Canvas apps and you're a maker? Well, designing, building, testing, and probably, going through the deployment phase as well. And so the challenges that you're going to have, because it's so easy to get started, is having discipline to start using things like naming conventions and patterns for getting back data, in a performant way. We'd also like to build consistency across team members. If you've used PowerApps, there's a lot of flexibility for you to kind of add your own style to the way that you build an app. But you can imagine that if you're inheriting an app that was started by some contractor and the things, very stylistic as far as how Bob's, thought these should be put together, it might not fit in with your team or it might not be understandable. So building consistency across team members who are all working on the same set of apps, is important. And also looking towards techniques that yield, adequate performance when you're accessing data. Now, I need to give credit where credit's due. So there's a very good white paper that was put out at the end of last year by a good friend of mine, Todd Baginski, fellow MVP, and Pat Dunn of Microsoft. And I'd say that if I switch over and now we kind of look at this white paper right here, it's about 30 pages. And certainly this white paper was the inspiration behind me creating this talk. I'm kind of hoping that maybe Todd will buddy up with me and kind of do this talk together in the future. But after this talk, I would highly recommend going through and reading this white paper and just making sure you digest all the different points that they put inside there. Now, as a Canvas app builder, here are the things that you should think of at a high level of your goals. Creating things that are simple. I think a famous architect once said, you should make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. Okay, readability. I want to be able to take a Canvas app built by someone else, go into some screen, look at a control, and know exactly, what that thing is for. The more you use these principles, the more you're going to have supportability. And also, the other things, ease of deployment, good performance, and maybe something you weren't thinking about, but accessibility. What happens when vision impaired people begin to use your Canvas app? Or what happens when the government realizes that you're creating a Canvas app and you haven't followed the law as far as guidelines for accessibility? So those are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at. Now, let's go ahead and give a quick look at the app that I'm going to be working with today. So let's go back here, and I'm going to open up this Canvas app called Customer Ordering with Azure SQL. And let's go ahead and open it up inside of edit mode. Now, before I go ahead and dive into the details, let's just kind of take a quick tour through this sample application. Another marketing plug, if you come and take one of our PowerApps courses, this is the app that you will build across day one. Okay, so let's go ahead and start it up. Okay, here's the welcome screen. Not all that exciting, but the idea is that we could go to browse customers and we could find a customer, great, or we can add a customer. I can either put in the customer name, or we have this little button that calls out to a web service through a custom connector that can automatically pull data. Okay, so here's Katrina O'Connell. If I don't like that, I'm just going to keep clicking on it, find a customer name that I like. And once we finally find a customer name, Lynette Skinner. Wow, that's just so close to Leonard Skinner. Let's go ahead and click OK. Okay, and the idea is that now that we have that, well, let's go ahead and create a shopping cart for this particular user. Now here, we have a bunch of different figures, so let's go ahead and buy a Batman action figure. We have the Twitter action follower, so how many of those do we want? Maybe I want 10 of those. Maybe we want to look at remote controls, and there's that really neat flying squirrel. Let's go ahead and grab one of those. And the idea is that you're going to build out a shopping cart, and then it's going to be time to check out. So now we have the order date information, we have the ability to submit an order, and now our order has been submitted, and we've added the order record and 3 order detail records, into our back-end SQL database. Okay, so let's go ahead and start looking at some of these screens and kind of also looking back at the slides. So first thing is screen names. what is not obvious, and it wasn't obvious to me until I read Todd and Pat's white paper, is that screen names are read aloud verbatim by screen readers. So if you have someone who's visually impaired and using a screen reader, and they basically, every time they navigate to the screen, they're basically just going to try to read it as if it was a sentence in a spoken language like English. So you can imagine as you start navigating from screen to screen, if you follow the rules of name should include spaces, avoid abbreviations, and they should end with the word screen inside there, one of the things that we should be able to do is, as people navigate from screen to screen with a screen reader, it's going to say add customer screen, browse customer screen. Now, secondly, as we start working with controls, we should follow specific naming conventions. Now, the white paper I pointed you to has a starting schedule of control types and the extensions that, or the prefixes that you should use. If I go back here, let's go ahead and take a look at something like, our welcome screen inside here. Maybe make it a little bit bigger here. What you can see here is that buttons have a BTN, labels have an LBY. If I, drill a little further inside here, you can also see that we're using grouping. So the idea here is that if you start putting lots of different components together to have a single purpose, such as if I go to the browse customer screen, and inside the browse customer screen we have this toolbar, but what you can see is that we have lots of different controls that make up the toolbar. And the idea is that, first of all, make sure all your control names have a prefix, and also we don't use abbreviations, but we just kind of spell things out such that someone can read the control name and figure out what's going on. Also there's this ability to do grouping. As a simple example here, let's say that we create a new screen. As I create a new screen, all of a sudden we add a label, and this label is going to be something like the background color. So I'm going to go back here, and I like to go to the home screen, and we'll go ahead and we'll do a fill. Maybe we'll do the vertical align. So we'll go to vertical align. We'll go ahead and put that up to top. And once we've gotten that, we'll make it bigger text-wise. We'll go ahead and center it. And now I've got some buttons that I want to put on the screen. So now I'll take button 1 and we'll create button 2. And I'm not going to take the time to rename these, but the idea here is that, now that I've got screen 1 and I've got these buttons, I'm going to hold down the Shift or Control key, select 1, select 2, select 3, and then from home, I can go to group and I can group things together. And the idea is that things are going to just be much neater. If you look at my screens here, what you'll find is at the top level, I usually just have about 3 groups. And here you can drill down, into a group inside there. But once again, it kind of helps you create sanity as you're, creating screens that have, 50, 100, or possibly more controls on them. Okay, now next thing we're going to look at is naming conventions for the type of variables and collections that you're creating. Now, collections are very big. The idea of a collection is you create something at app scope, so they're global across screens, and it holds a table with records. So we're going to start naming ours col. So as an example, if I go back here into our app and we go look at collections, you can see all the different collections that we have. We have a collection for the product catalog that we're going to fill up when the application starts up. We're going to have one, which is the navigation table, which is basically going to give us a single way to initialize the navigation links that we want to cross our application. So for instance, if I come back up here and we want to navigate to home and then browse customer, and the idea is that it might be more maintainable, if we could just have a single collection in the application that defines that. Okay, now another thing that you have to get comfortable with is working with the PowerApps formula language. And when we start out, it's very different from VBA. If I was writing VBA code, I could write a piece of code that looks at a text box and sets its text property. But in PowerApps, the Canvas app model is much different. So every control has a set of properties that take care of themselves. It's fully independent. So if you want to click a button and all of a sudden see something appear in a label or text box, generally what we need to do is create some type of a global variable or a collection and have our code modify the state that we've created in that variable or collection. And then we'll have the text box or label have a dynamic formula that reads that from memory inside there. Now, another thing that we have to get used to when working with PowerApps is that some properties are really events. So the most obvious one would be on select on a button. There's on change, screens have on visible, the app has on start. Now, when you start using PowerApps, the first thing we learn is that we don't write code to go out and manipulate an object. We write formulas that basically determine the value of different properties. Now, there is some exceptions. And sometimes you write code that does something. It just does something to a variable or possibly to state in the server. So imperative actions are setting the value of a global variable, a context variable, adding one or more items to a collection, navigating between screens, possibly submitting data back to the server with a patch call. Now, quite often we need to do multiple things at once. So what you're going to see here, let's say I go back and I take a look at something like our submit order screen, and we go look at that submit order button, and I drop this down. So here is an example, of doing one thing right here. And notice that we have the semicolon at the end that basically says after this statement is evaluated, and if it's imperative, it actually takes an action, and we wait sequentially, for that action to complete, and then we execute the next one. So the idea that if you have multiple actions, we just chain them together with a semicolon and just make sure you don't put a semicolon, after the very last item. Now, here's an example of our application on start. So we want to go ahead and load in some data. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to load in all the products from the SQL database, what we'll call the product catalog. Now, the other thing we might want to do is just initialize something like our navigation table. So if I go back here and I go to the app, you can see that the app, has this on start event inside here. Currently the app only has one property on start. The PowerApps team has talked about adding on error, which we'll probably get sometime soon. Now, another issue is if you haven't been watching PowerApps for the last month or two, on start used to be on the very first screen. You used to go to the first screen and you'd find on start here. They raised it up to app, so that was something that made things a lot more understandable because the app has it on start. Why would an arbitrary screen have it on start? The second great thing they did for you is they allow you to right click and say run on start. So we had this problem before they did that where you had to close out of edit mode and reopen your Canvas app in edit mode just to get the on app or the on start to fire. And now once again, you change your logic, you just come up here and click run on start. Okay, while I'm thinking about it, another nice thing, and I think it was out for a month or two before I realized it, is that it used to be that you had to start the app, to be able to click buttons and test them out. And so recently they've added something where you're in edit mode, you don't have to start the app, hold down the Alt key, and all of a sudden you can click buttons, and get the effect of the button formula firing inside there. Okay, so just making sure everyone knows those recent additions. Now, if you look at this table right here, what I tried to do is show you two sets of functions. One, the ones that are not highlighted, just basically calculate a value and return that when the function is called. The highlighted functions are imperative, so those go out and actually do something. Whether it's navigation, whether it's changing a variable value, or whether it's posting an update to SQL Server. Okay, so I just want to leave this chart just so you can kind of get an overview of the different types. Now, next thing we're going to do is talk about screen design. And the first thing I want to do is introduce this idea of relative styling. So let's go look at a different app here. I have a very simple app to show this, and it's called the Relative Styling Demo. A good name for a relative styling demo. And so what I want to show here is I wanted to keep it simple. So I have 4 different controls. So here we have TXT first name label. Now, if I look at something like the text box underneath it, let's go look at a couple of its properties. So let's say that I go down and I look at the size property. So the size property of the text box is dictated by the size property, of the label above it. Okay, fine. How about if I go and look at the width property? And the width property is the same. So the idea is if I move this out, the others are going to move, to be able to deal with that inside there. So basically, I have the width, height, and font synced up. And the idea here is now if I make something bigger and I go ahead and kind of change the font size, well, that's going to work out well. And now also the Y is going to be different. Now X is the same. There's a little bit of a delay, but as I move this back and forth, you're going to see that all 3 of these controls down below are kind of slave to the top control. And they basically say, my X property is the same as that top label's X property. Now, when it gets to the Y property, we need to have a little bit, more specific stuff. So here I can basically say, take the Y of the control above and then add the width, and that kind of takes you down and gets you where you are. As we keep going down and kind of looking at the Y property right here, you can basically see that the control above, we take its Y property and its height. Maybe I want to add a little spacing, so I've added 24. But the idea is that now if you have a whole bunch of controls and I want to kind of change them around real quickly, it gets to be kind of an easy thing as opposed to you, having to, do this work, individually with all these different controls right here. Okay. The last thing that I want to point out is that it's really easy to get into trouble. So now if I take a look at something, like the width property of this, and then I go and kind of move it, it gets rid of my formula and puts a hard-coded value inside there. And now, what you're going to see is that, all of a sudden I've kind of broken things inside there. So just be careful, not adjusting properties that you have dynamic formulas on, because it's very easy to kind of trigger that PowerApps Studio effect of putting the literal value back inside there. Okay. Now, next thing I want to look at is when we are designing screens and binding data. So we have table level binding, and we can do that, with a gallery control or a data table. I find the gallery control much, much more useful than the data table control. And then you have single record binding that you can do with either a display form or an edit form. Now, we want to use galleries as much as possible. And let's say I wanted to do something like create this type of effect. Let's go back and take a look at this browse customer screen inside here. Okay, and I want to have something where I can look through and do something like let's filter by F or by N or turn that back on. So what you're able to do is, in this case, I inserted a blank horizontal gallery. Now with the blank horizontal gallery, let's go down inside here, and here's the gallery of the search buttons inside. I'm going to have to make this a lot bigger right here. But what you can see is that I create a gallery, and then I just basically put the alphabet, as a table of letters inside there. Now, inside the actual button right here, what you can see is that, first of all, we need the text property inside for each of these buttons. So we're just taking this item.value. And then what happens when someone clicks on that particular button right here? And what you're going to see is that we have a local context variable called loc, and that stands for local. So remember that if this is a context variable, we're going to say local. If it was a global variable, we'd say something like GBL, just so we can tell instantly from looking at it, what is the scope of that variable inside here. Okay, now once we've kind of got that set up and we look at the gallery for customers, we're going to have something that looks like this inside here, and that is, if is blank. If we don't have a customer filter, give me the whole customers table. If we have a customer filter, well, then give me the customers table, but filter it by looking for people whose last name starts with that inside there. Now, in our case right here, it gets to be, very easy to create these buttons right here. So back up here, you can see that, between clearing the filter and looking for people whose name, begins with V inside there, that gets to be easy. What happens as I start typing inside, you can kind of still make this work. The problem is you kind of have to click outside, before you can propagate that value. Okay, so once again, this isn't as great an experience as we'd like, but still what you can do is that in our case right here, we are looking for this one event handler, which is on change. And if someone types inside there, and once again, it doesn't capture per keystroke, it captures once you have a value and you tab out, which makes it so that, it's not quite as user-friendly, as we'd like it to be. Okay, but just some other examples of galleries. We have basically the gallery that shows our customers. And note that if I go back and we take a look at this gallery inside here, which is the gallery customers, let's also go ahead and show all the different customers. With our gallery, if we look down here, we have a wrap count of 3. If I turn that to a wrap count of 1, well, we'd only see, 1 in each line. But now if I take the wrap count, switch it to 2, I got 2, and now I've kind of optimized things, so I can basically just put, many customers in there at once. Okay. Also, some of the other things, we're going to look at the product browsing screen in just a second, but that's created with a gallery. I have several places where we're showing the shopping cart, both before the order is submitted and after the order, has been successfully submitted, and those are done with galleries. Okay, now, if you're going to use edit forms can be really helpful. My own personal preference is if I'm dealing with a single table of data, edit forms work out, and they have some really nice benefits. As you start getting to having to update 2 tables at once, edit forms get to be a little bit tricky and maybe not worth the bother. Now, let's look at a couple different patterns that we have here. So here's an example where I have the Add Customer screen. Now, behind the Add Customer screen, we, of course, have this particular form, the Add Customer form, and we have all these different data cards. And the idea of the data cards, if I go back up to Advanced, notice that if you build your edit form, it will automatically see which columns in your underlying database are required and automatically add that inside there. Now, it turns out for the underlying database, if I go to email address, that's not required. But one of the things that we can do is we can unlock the card and make it required. And therefore, you're going to have the form have this action. Now, if I go back here, it's not an action. I take that back. But it is a property. So when we look at this button, and we're going to go look at the display mode. So what we're going to say is if the form is valid, which means that first name, last name, and email address are not blank, well, then we want to highlight it. But we want to do a little bit more work beyond, the validation rules that are in the database. So in particular, what we'd like to do here is, let's go ahead and put in, our new particular user, Frank Burns. He works for MASH. And now notice that if I add something in, X, all of a sudden I have this validation rule pop in. Now, I don't want to bring it up when the control is blank because you're yelling at the user before the user's had a chance to fill things in. But once that user fills something in, what we're going to do is we're going to have to, do xyz.co. And so what we're going to see back here is that there's a two-step process. One is we want to show this error message. So down here inside of add customer, let's go ahead and move to that one card, which is the email address, and let's go to the error is visible. So here, what we have is an error message control was automatically added as part of this data card. So we're going to say, if parent update, and once again, the error message control is a child to the data card. So if we say parent update, we say, what is the email address, that's currently in that text box. So if it's blank, or if it matches, so here's a really nice thing that we have is match, and I want to look at the update and make sure it matches the pattern for an email address. Then we can basically add the address or not. If I go back here once more time, up to not the form, but the button itself. So let's go back to this button. And what we can see here is that now when I look at the display mode, and we go ahead and look at the display mode for this, what we can see, let's go ahead and format the text, is that if the form is valid, and remember that the form valid is not going to catch things like whether you have a valid email address. So basically we add that inside there, and now we have something where, let's go ahead and start it one more time to kind of see this pattern. And what you're going to see up here, look at the button. If that is blank, you can't save it. Once you put something in, well, it's still not going to enable you to save, until you basically put in, something that matches, a pattern, that is accepted, as an email address. Note that they have match email. They don't have match phone number, but they allow regular expressions. So using regular expressions, you can, and they're not hard to find via Google. You could basically do the same type of pattern matching, for something like a phone number, a product number that has to follow a specific pattern. Now, next thing I want to look at is using the patch statement. So quite often we like edit forms, and they work great in certain cases. Let me jump into another demo just to kind of show you some fundamentals. So this one, let's go ahead and open up. Now, in this demo right here, I have a simple SharePoint site, and I've created a custom list named Books, and it has a title column and a ISBN column. Okay, for some reason I put the author name in the ISBN column. But now, if we look back here, at this demo here, I've got a edit form right here. And some of the nice things about the edit form is that if I go to this particular edit form, now I can say edit fields, and it gets to be very easy to add fields, or to move things around inside there. Likewise, I've got rules that I can add inside, and there's kind of a validation layer. Now, the way that forms work is that you have to call new form to initialize it. Once you do that, you call submit form. Now here I have new form on a button, though we usually put it, in on visible. Let's go ahead and you can see that with the form, it doesn't display until you call new form. Once it comes up, PowerApps Bible, and let's say that has 1, 2, 3, 4 submit form. You can see that gets submitted inside there. Okay, now let's look at patch instead. So with patch, you have the patch function. There's the data source I want to update. You basically kind of need a default record. So when you say default books, it provides that for you. Also note that if you're doing a lot of this throughout an app, you can take default books and you can load it into a global variable at start time. So you don't have to kind of pay for going out to the server and find out what the default record is. But then we just basically create a record and we write that back inside there. So now what you can see here is that you don't really have the beauty of a form. Instead, we're going to have, a need to kind of do validation rules ourselves. But as far as, writing to a SharePoint list, they basically work the exact same way. Okay. Now, here's an example of what our app is doing. We want to basically add a new order. And then after we add the order, we want to add the order detail records inside here. So the top example here, is using patch. And here's the defaults, and here's the record, that we're trying to add in. Now, also, we're going to be saving the order details inside of a collection, which is called shopping cart. So there's a really neat trick, and that is you use the for all function. When you use the for all, you basically say for all, and you point to a collection. And then it basically just kind of moves through that collection and executes patch once for every item inside. And note that when you're inside here, the things in the collection are just kind of seen as local variables. Okay, so that kind of works out pretty well. Now, next thing we want to talk about, is delegation. Now, the idea of delegation is that if your Power App needs to search through customers and you have a really big database, we want the filtering or searching to occur on the back end in the database. We don't want to bring all the data back to our Canvas app, especially if it's running on a 3-year-old iPhone, and try to do the work there. Now, I have a very simple demo that's going to show you some key points. One of the files that I gave you is this customers.xls file. And what I want to point out is I want to go down in this file and go down just under 500. And notice that there is this customer named Aaron Barrera. Great. Okay. So now let's go ahead, and I have this app right here, which is customer search. And one of the issues is that we're using the OneDrive connector to read data from an Excel workbook, and it doesn't support delegation to any degree. So we'll go ahead and run this, and notice that it allows me to look for things inside here. And so if I go ahead and run the app, and now I look for Barrera, I can't find it. Yet I know it's inside here. Why is it not finding it? And the issue is that for non-delegatable data sources, let's go back up here. Let's go into advanced settings, and there is this value of 500. So the idea is it's only going to bring back 500 records. And if you're doing search, it's bringing back the first 500 records, and it searches through that, so it doesn't find anything beyond 500. Now, just for conceptual understanding, let's go ahead and switch that to 2000. I switched that to 2000. Okay, let's go back here. Let's go ahead and run that one more time. And now, what we're going to see is there's Barrera, so it's now finding things that are beyond that 500. Of course, if there are things beyond 2000, you're not going to find that. So the key point is that many times you can't work with non-delegatable data sources. So SharePoint, SQL Server, Common Data Service, those all are good at supporting delegation, but you also have to look into what types of operations, are supported. And typically filtering and searching and ordering are going to be supported, but now we're starting to get more delegation where things like aggregation, taking 1,000 rows of invoices for a customer and basically aggregating down to a single row and showing me the total amount per customer, those are now, starting to be delegatable as well. But, what's up to you is knowing the connector you're working with and knowing what it supports. Last comment here is, can you bring back 500 items? Can you bring back 2,000 items? And we find that, in the browser, it tends to work pretty well. On mobile devices, if you have, this year's iPhone or Android, it might work pretty well. But we hear a lot of customer complaints, that someone has a 4-year-old iPhone or Android, just doesn't have the specs, and all of a sudden, it really starts getting bogged down with performance. Now, a couple other notes. Once again, I like to give credit where credit's due. There is a famous blog post by a very smart fellow on the PowerApps team, and here's his name right there. I am still practicing pronouncing his name, so I'm going to get better at that. But just a couple of this is definitely worth the read through. So some of the things that he'll talk about, is load patterns. The idea that you want to turn on some type of an icon that shows, some type of a loading symbol, get your data. When that returns, go ahead and turn off the, the loading GIF. Okay. There's also the ability, not through the browser, but when you use mobile devices, to save data locally. So if you use load data, it looks to see if on your mobile device you've saved data. And so, here's this pattern where if you have to load data in, now let me go ahead and kind of go back to an example right here. In customer orders, in the app start, we're going to go basically to the products table and preload it in. So when I keep going back to the product order form, I don't have to keep going back to the database. So if I preload the collection once, performance is going to be much better. And of course, there's a trade-off of how much data are you loading in, and is it too much data for the type, of devices that you're targeting. But in our case right here, we only have 20 or 30 products. It's pretty easy to load it all into memory at one time. But taking that one more step, instead of having to load it from the server, if you have a mobile device and you call save data the last time and that data is available locally, they can just load it from the local cache on the mobile device, and that's going to speed things up. Okay, another thing that can help is using the concurrent function. So if you don't use the concurrent function and you do a bunch of clear collects, it's going to execute them all sequentially. The second one doesn't start until the first one is over. However, when we call concurrent, it's able to dispatch these across multiple threads. And not only that, let's say that we have 4 different database calls. It waits till the last one is done, and then it continues on. So concurrent works pretty well. Realize there are throttling. So if you had 1,000 users that were making concurrent calls with 10 calls apiece, there would be throttling to make it so that, you wouldn't get as much of the concurrency, as maybe you might expect. But what you'll find is if you have 4 calls to make and you do it concurrently, you're going to cut your load time down in half. Okay. Now, next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about state management and some of the ways that we solve problems. Now, you can have one control change a property value on another control. You can have one control change the state, whether it's a collection or a global variable or a local variable, and the other control can have a dynamic property that reads that. So what we tend to work with a lot is collections. So there are quite a few collections that I'm going to demo in this sample app. Also, we can use context variables, and we can use global variables. Note that if you took a global variable and you loaded a table into it, it would basically be the same thing as a collection. Now, here's an example. Let's go ahead and move back to the customer ordering. So what we want to do is we want to have some type of a UI when people are browsing products to come down here and make changes down inside here. So once again, if I look at this box inside here, you're going to find that the 2 buttons that are the up and down arrow can't really change a control property, but they can basically change something that is a column. Now, the technique that we're going to use is that when we load in the product catalog, in addition to the columns from the database table, we're going to add one more column, which is quantity. And then we're just basically going to read quantity inside there. Now, what's going to happen when someone clicks the up and down buttons? We're basically going to reach in and patch. Now, if you try to do this with a global variable, what you're going to find is when you change the quantity for Batman, it's going to change the quantity for everything. So you need a per row variable, and the way to get that is to add this extra column into your collection. So once again, the effect that we're looking for here, is being able to kind of move up, being able to move down inside here. You can also see when quantity is 1, the down button becomes disabled, so you can go up and then down. And once you get to a certain point, click that, and we're able to push our values inside there. Okay, now let's look at another example. In this example, I showed you patch, but what I didn't mention, which is very important, is that when you call patch, there is a return value. So when you call patch, you send the data that you want to add for a new row into the SQL database. Patch returns with another record. And that record, basically is post adding the record to the database, and it will have things like the order ID. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have this shopping cart. Let's go ahead and, maybe add a couple more things inside here. Everybody loves SpongeBob. Let's go ahead and take the SpongeBob coloring book, add a couple of those inside there. Okay, so now let's go to our checkout, to our submit order screen. Now, before I add this in here, let's go ahead and look at 2 different collections. So there is the last order, okay, customer ID and order ID, and there's the last order details. Well, that's from the last order. So now what we're going to do is when I go ahead and click this inside there, patch is going to bring back these different pieces of data that I need. So what we can see here is that, let's go back and let me get to the order submit screen, and once again, we're going to do the first record, which is creating the order. But when we're done, we're going to basically create this data inside of a collection called call last order. And when I look at that inside there, collection call last order, now it's been updated. And the idea is that this will run sequentially. And so when that has run, I basically put that order into call last order. And then down here, when we start adding the child records inside there, we're able to go to call last order. So it's always a table. And when it has a single record, like I just added an order, I have to call first. But now I can get the order ID. So when I'm adding the child detail records, with this for all, I basically build out the shopping cart, and we're going to spin through here, and we're going to create the call last order. Another important aspect of this is that you have your submit order screen. If I look at the submit order screen right here, and I take a look at my shopping cart, let's go ahead and look at this, and we're going to look at the items property inside here, and I'm not looking at the right thing. Let's go back here, and now when I look at, so here we have the collection for the shopping cart. When we go to the order confirmation screen, let's go ahead and drill down, and let's go into, this shopping cart. And, as we look at, this shopping cart inside here, what we should, be doing, is basically using the last details. I have a little patch up here. Okay, it looks like I forgot to do that, and now I'm kind of correcting myself. But the idea is you don't want to look at the data of what you sent to the database and hope the data went through. If you look at the return value of patch, you're looking at the data that you have confirmed, has been entered inside of the database, which is why we need those 2. Okay. So, the idea of, populating those, from those 2 collections, just kind of gives you the confidence that that data has, successfully been entered into the database. Now, the last thing we want to look at is designing components. Now, components are brand new. Let me give you kind of a quick look at a component in a brand new app, and then I'll come back and kind of show how they work. So let's say that I create a new Canvas app. So components are something that's been put in a preview for the last month or so. Let's go to create a simple app with a table layout. Now, what you'll notice at first is I can't use components. However, if I go to App Settings and Advanced Settings and all the way down, and notice that we have preview features. Preview features are things that aren't ready to ship, but they want you to start using them. Then they have experimental features, which are like preview, but there's a lot more risk that it might change. So if you use it in your app and they decide to change it to make it better, things are going to break. Okay. But the idea is that we can go ahead and turn on components inside here. Now that I've turned on components, what you can see is you have a screens and a components tab. And now I can say, give me a new component. So let's say that for this component, I say 3366, and I say 80. And now that I've got that inside here, let's go ahead and put a background color in place. Now, for this, I'm going to do something real simple. We have about 10 minutes left, but I don't want to spend too long on this initial demo. But when you create components, one of the things that you're going to see is a component is encapsulated. A component can't see the screen names. It can't see anything, but it can have properties. So let's go ahead and create this one. I'm going to call this one app title. And now we'll come back here and we'll call it app title. When you create a property, you mark it as either an input property or an output property. Note that input-output properties are not supported. You'd have to create two. And you get lots of different types. So we're going to use simple text right here. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and insert a label. And so with this label, I'm going to put this inside here. And where's the label going to be initialized from? Let's initialize it from the component property. So if I go back to the component, remember I've created a property called app title. So in my component, I can basically initialize that, and it's not going to be data for my screens yet, but I have to put something inside there. Now that I've done that, let's go back to our label, and let's go to the text property. And so I can say parent that basically goes from the control up to the component, and I can now grab that app title property. Now, to make this look better, I should go ahead and change this to a bigger font and 28. And maybe down here, we'll go ahead and we'll take the padding and put it out to 20. And that was the wrong padding. Okay, so now that I've got that set, let's go ahead and use it. So now we go back to screens. I got screen 1 and I've got screen 2. So if I go to screen 1 and now we go here to components, well, there's my component 1. Let's go ahead and put that in place. Let's go to screen 2 and do the same thing. We'll add the component there. But now what you're going to see is that each screen, basically allows me to set this property right here. Okay, so this one's going to be screen 1. Great. And now this one is going to be screen 2. And so now that I've done that, let's say I wanted to make some changes. So I go back to the component and, we decide that we're going to make management happy, by making this a different color, putting this in the middle, making this a little bit bigger inside here. And now let's go back to our screens. And what you can see is that now I can adjust my component and I don't have to, have it work across screens. Okay, or at least I don't have to make changes across screens. So now let's go ahead and look back in custom ordering. So what we've done here is we've created a component. And if I look at this component right here, it is the top nav bar. So what are the different properties that we have? So I've added one property, which is going to be the screen title. I've added a second property, which is the app logo image. And then I've added a third one, which is a table. So note that when you create a property, one of the things that's very flexible is you can define a property as a table or record. Now, once you do that, let's go back here and kind of take a look at this property navigation table. So when you initialize it, I just decided to initialize mine with records that have a nav title and a nav target. Once again, in here, you can't use screen names, so the component cannot see the screens of the app. And that's all because of the way that they use it encapsulation. But you can define the type for nav target by using app.ActiveScreen. And so now that we've done that, what you see here is that we have a gallery, and this gallery is just basically reading, what's inside of that table inside here. Now, let's go ahead and go back to our screens. So here, we're going to have the welcome screen. And, inside of the welcome screen, we have these properties. But what's really nice about that is that each screen, will have to have a screen title that's different. However, we have an app icon. So if I go back to File and Media, basically I've uploaded an app icon, and it's just basically called app icon. So that's kind of a global. And then also for the table here, what we're doing here is that we're passing a table called call navigation table to the component. And even though these properties, have to be added to the component on every screen, because we're loading it from a global table, it gives us a lot of flexibility. So a couple examples of that will be, you can see that we have home inside here. What if I want to change home to welcome? So we'll go back here. And because we're initializing this, all in one place, I go ahead, I make that change. Once we've made that change inside here, let's go ahead and collapse that. And did I hit save? I hit save, but what I forgot to do is run on start. Remember, if you're kind of initializing things, you might need to run this one more time. Okay, so I've got welcome, I've got in start. For some reason it's not pushing those changes across inside there. Okay, well, hopefully, that gives you kind of the idea that you've created this component. You then have to kind of work through creating the interface, in terms of, you creating component properties. Back here, you can see that, I've created 3 properties, but the idea is that you get encapsulation. Now, the last thing I'll say about components is that there's really 2 things that you can do with a component. The grand vision is once you create a component, you can basically load it into Canvas App Project 1, 2, and 3. So the idea is that the component can know nothing about a project because it has to be able to be generic to load into any type of project. Now, the second type of usage might be a little less grand in the fact that I just want to have a UI component that I can reuse across different screens in the same Canvas app. And you'd think, if I go down, into my component, let's go, into a piece of code, and then, I want to say navigate, and I want to get to a particular screen inside here, and what you'll see is you can't see any screens. So once again, the component can't see what's inside the app. And that's because components were really kind of designed for this grand vision of being reused across projects. So what that means is you just have to be, a little bit more thoughtful about your component design. But the idea is you create a new component. You're going to add the component properties to kind of see what the app needs to push into the component. And then whether you have a component you want to reuse across all screens or just on one screen, that's, things that, dictate how you design. Then you're going to implement, the component UI and your behavior. You're going to add the component to one or more screens. And then the idea is you go back to the component and you make updates to it, and that automatically, pushes those updates, into what you've done inside there. Okay, and that takes us, to the end of our session. Once again, let me kind of call out, if you like this type of training, you want to build the app, look into some of our hands-on training courses, either the day of or the 3-day building business solutions with PowerApps and Flow. So once again, everybody, thanks for coming and attending our session today. Hope you found it useful, and hopefully we'll do more of these moving forward. So everyone have a great day. Thanks very much for spending time with us at Critical Path Training.